Hospitality Meets is brought to you by RotaCloud, the simple workforce management software for hospitality teams. RotaCloud lets you create and share rotas, record attendance, and manage your team's annual leave, all in less time than it takes to make a brew. It can also make life easier for your staff, allowing them to check their rotas, request holiday, and even pick up extra shifts, all through the RotaCloud mobile app. Start your 30-day free trial today by visiting rotacloud.com/Phil and find out how much easier managing your team can be. Welcome to Hospitality Meets with me, Phil Street, where each week we take a light-hearted look into the stories and individuals that make up the wonderful world of hospitality. Today's guest is Professor Peter Jones, chairman of the Crumbs project, amongst many other things. Coming up on today's show, Peter places a big demand on Phil.
I want a hotel school in the UK. Can you get me one?
Phil talks about a few of his challenges. Turning up on time, smartly dressed, taking pride. And Peter seems to love raspberries.
We ended up with raspberries coming out of absolutely bloody everywhere.
All that and so much more as we chat through Peter's amazing journey so far. Peter has an amazing story as well as a cracking message around the work he is doing with the Crumbs project. So please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share everywhere you can. Enjoy. And a huge Hospitality Meets welcome to Professor Peter Jones.
Phil, thank you. Delighted to be here.
Good. How's life?
Yeah, fine, thank you. Yeah, busy as always, but yeah, we're okay.
Yeah, busy. I can understand because actually when I was looking through your LinkedIn profile ahead of this chat, I mean, by crikey, you seem to have your head in quite a lot of stuff.
Yes, I do actually. I think that would be called a portfolio.
Very good. Yeah, that's a better way of putting it than a load of stuff.
Yeah, it's quite a wide portfolio, but those are things which interest me, and I don't do anything that I'm not interested in. So, that wide portfolio reflects my interests as well as far as the industry and education is concerned.
Yeah, great. Well, I am sure that we will get into kind of all of the stuff that you've got your head into, your portfolio, over the fullness of talking about your journey. But for the purposes of very simplistic stakes, for those of the listeners who don't know who you are, just tell the world who you are and what it is that you're currently doing.
Yep. Peter Jones. What I currently do, what perhaps my main area of my portfolio at the moment is that I'm the chair of a small disability charity in Bournemouth called Crumbs, where we provide hospitality education and training for adults with learning and mental health disabilities. So that's, if you like, the key element of what I'm doing at the moment. But beyond that, then I'm involved in International Association of Hotel Schools. I do for the Institute of Hospitality. But my main focus at the moment is in relation to disability and trying to encourage employers in the industry to take on people who may have particularly learning difficulties, because I think that's an untapped workforce that we largely ignore.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Where did this interest level come from, Peter, to get involved in this?
It came, I've been involved with this charity now for 9 years. So prior to that, again, I had a portfolio, but I didn't really come into contact with too many people that were perhaps had that range of different disabilities. There was an old colleague of mine who introduced me to the charity, asked me if I would get involved because at the time, the trustees of the charity needed some further input in terms of professional input, if you like, from an education and training point of view. The charity had always been involved in hospitality training, but there wasn't anybody within the mix of the trustees that really had that sort of strength of background. So I was invited to become involved, and then the rest, as they say, is history. I've been involved for the last 9 years.
Yeah, superb. And I completely agree with you. I mean, this is something that I think as an industry, we absolutely have to look at all of the potential avenues to explore groups of or pockets of society that perhaps have maybe been forgotten or not focused on correctly from an employment perspective, because what a great opportunity for the industry. We should be the best industry at this anyway, right? In terms of welcoming everyone in.
Yeah. And when you think about it, we have a very diverse workforce anyway. But one of the areas of that diversity that seems to me to be missing is people who may present with difficulties. And what we tend to do as an industry is we're looking for the ideal candidate all the time. And so,
Yeah.
you have both the profile of what you're looking for, but you also have a mindset that says, well, I'm losing one of those, I need another one, instead of thinking perhaps slightly out of the box and saying, well, I need another one of those, but who out there could possibly do not necessarily all of that role, but some of that role? So could we think about doing some of that recruitment differently? And one of the issues, I mean, I was on a discussion yesterday within the public sector, looking at this whole idea. And of course, one of the issues that comes back when you're talking, especially to big organizations, is that they say, oh, well, of course, it's our processes. So somebody has to make an application online, they have to be interviewed, they have to do this. And you think to yourself, yes, but what you're doing immediately is you're setting up so many different barriers that you're making it almost impossible for somebody who may present with learning difficulties, who could actually be an incredibly valuable member of your team, but you're stopping them at the word go because the process that you've put in place mitigates against it. And that's one of the issues, really, especially in the large organizations. Smaller organizations, you have a different problem, which is, how would I cope? Can I find what happens if something goes wrong? And there you have to assure them that, well, if something goes wrong, we're here. We're here to help you, but also to help them. I mean, as an organization, we're a disability confident leader. So we can provide advice to organizations about how do you manage situations and circumstances where you've got people working for you who may have disabilities.
Brilliant. Yeah. Actually, really, what we're talking about is it's changing the mindset of the business into focusing rather than what can't they do. It's kind of what
Yes,
can they do,
exactly.
and then so you almost need to kind of strip it right back a little bit and unpick your own structures, as it were. And because I actually don't think having a rigid structure to as a way to do things is a healthy part of business anyway. But that's
No.
just my own opinion. So, actually what we do as businesses a lot of the time is when you lose somebody from your workforce, and in whatever way that happens, is that you just try to replace like for like, don't you? And that's, it's sometimes impossible because everybody has their own set of skills and all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But yeah, it's really about actually looking at the opportunity rather than the difficulty.
Yes, it is. I think it's looking at the positives and I'm trying to understand what those positives about the individual actually brings to your business. And that's interesting reflections. So if you talk to organizations and businesses that have employed people with disabilities, especially over some period of time, and again, I was talking to an organization yesterday that took one of our trainees 10 years ago who's still in the same role in the same job, and they're a chef.
Right.
Now, okay, I think they work 20 hours a week or whatever it might be, but they are diligent, they're loyal, they're competent at doing what that organization requires of them, and they've been there for 10 years. Now, the
Yeah.
impact that has on that business is that there's limited staff turnover because they do tend to be loyal, they do tend to stick with one particular employer, especially if the employer looks after them. But also you
Mm.
have to recognize that people with disabilities tend to come from smaller communities where they are embedded in that community. It might be a sheltered housing community, they might be living with carers and so on. So geographically, they don't move around very much. They need to be fairly close to where the workplace is. So you get that degree of loyalty. Largely as a result, I think, of their own mindset, but also their physical location. So you're in
Yeah.
that sort of situation. But the other thing that I find fascinating in a way is how the organizations, those that are employing people, will say how it's improved their own team and their own workforce. And when you ask them why or how, it's more about the inclusiveness that they recognize that the person has some difficulties, They're there to support and to help them. They're doing what you said. They're in the hospitality business. They're actually looking after people. So they look after that person as a member of their team. They encourage them as a member of their team. They're a little bit protective of them. But the other thing is that they say is that it improves the team performance. And you say, well, why does it improve the team performance? I said, well, quite frankly, it means that because they have to explain to the person, especially at the beginning of their time there, about what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and that might need to be reinforced and it needs to be supervised. They're paying more attention to the detail of the job. They're also having to think about what they are doing in order to explain it to somebody else. When they start thinking about what they're doing, they actually tend to be, if you like, more professional. They're looking for to improve the professionalism of the person with disability. In turn, they're actually improving their own professionalism because they're thinking about what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. So it's almost, you're kind of not, you're not just taking for granted the
No,
processes and whatever your workflow is or has been. It's, it's kind of,
correct.
you really have to kind of knuckle down and think about everything, which is, yeah, it's healthy.
It's very healthy, and it also makes you think about, well, why are we doing it that way? Perhaps if we were to do it slightly differently, we would actually improve it for everybody. But you're absolutely right when you say, if you think about, you employ somebody and they might be working in food service, so you'd say to them, well, go and lay the table, and somebody might have an attempt at laying the table, but it doesn't meet your professional standards. So you've got to go over and you've got to intervene. But then you think about, well, why are we doing it this way? Is it better to put all the knives down first, then the forks? Do we do a place setting at a time? How do we actually fold the napkins? Where are the napkins actually going to be laid on the table? How many glasses are we putting on the table, and so on? Now, you would make an assumption often that somebody will just pick that up from looking at a previous setting. If you've got somebody with some difficulties, they need the reinforcement, and they would need that degree of communication, if you like, certainly in the early stages, until they become confident in what they're doing is correct. And so that then forces you both to think about the job, explain the job, improve your own performance and their performance on the job. And at the same time, you're often thinking about, well, actually, why, if we were to do it like this, would that not be better anyway?
Mm, yeah, absolutely. We've kind of done this the wrong way around. We normally do all of this stuff at the end when we get to that part of your journey, and then,
Oh,
but it's
okay.
really cool
Never
because
mind.
I think it's no, I don't mind at all. The thing that I really love about this, and this is something that I think is, and I've spoken about this on this podcast before, is that I got a health diagnosis in age 39, which doesn't affect my life that much at the moment, but it is debilitating, and at some point it may well do. And
Yep.
so I don't get bogged down in the what ifs at the moment. I'm mindful of it, and that it might play some part in my life in the future. So all the while I'm thinking to myself, I've learnt this from my mum and dad, is to be you kind of a futurist about your own life,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
look ahead and wonder about the good, the bad, and the ugly that might happen along the way. So to get behind a cause like you're doing, I think it absolutely speaks to my own heart about that, because ultimately I might find myself in a situation whereby I need other people to give me a leg up,
Yep.
and so I
Yep.
don't think we need to. You can never really imagine or think that you can get through life entirely on your own, and
No.
that you're always going to have all of the answers and all of that. And so actually to kind of shine a light on work like you're doing, I think is incredibly valuable,
Mm.
for I suppose also get people thinking a little bit differently about their workforce,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah, and that's really, I guess, my mission at the moment, if I have one of those sorts of things, um, is to get people to think about the workforce differently. So I've written quite a few articles about it. I've tried to raise the profile, not just of what we do, but it really is. It just begs that fundamental question: can you think differently about the roles that you're looking for? Can you think differently about the type of person that you might be looking for to fulfill those roles? And what we tend to find in our industry is you find extremely good but very isolated examples where somebody perhaps with Down syndrome is being employed. I think the Hilton of where is it, the Aldwych or somewhere, I'm not sure, but where there is somebody on their team with Down syndrome. But that's one person in one hotel. Now, there may well be others, but that it is not a universal truth that we find people with those sorts of disabilities actually working in the industry. Now, let me give you an example of something that I was quite touched by, actually. And the nature of the disability is very different. But I was in India 2 years ago, and I was staying in a very, very nice, rather opulent hotel in Calcutta. And one of the doormen, opened the door and had a small, I suppose, like a lanyard round his neck, in which he had a little sign saying, "Excuse me for not speaking, but I'm deaf." Okay. So
Yep.
I was able to sign to that individual because we do some basic signing with some of our trainees who may have some language difficulties. That doesn't mean to say they can't understand you, but they can't actually necessarily communicate because their language skills, we have one or two people over time that have been non-verbal. They can hear you perfectly well, but they have a real problem in terms of verbalizing. So I was able to say, well, thank you very much to him in sign language. Now, the expression on his face was worth a million smiles,
Yeah.
because somebody recognized him for who he was, what he was doing, recognized his disability, but thanked him for doing that role. Now, again, that's one small isolated example, but the value that that had to me as a customer was inestimable. If I had the opportunity to go back and I had the choice of hotels, I would probably choose that hotel, not because the bedrooms were bigger, but because they were employing somebody who I had an empathy with.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and we often miss a lot of those little nuances and things. We like to think that we're doing a great job. We like to think that we're doing the right thing and we're employing people with these sorts of disabilities. But even when we do employ them, often we keep them at the back rather than at the front. And again, that's another issue for me as well, is that when you look, especially if somebody has got Down syndrome, for example, then it's fairly obvious to most people that they have got Down syndrome. So what do you do then? How do you treat them? How does the customer treat them? How do they treat the customer, and so on? And I think we get afraid of some of these things sometimes. We don't like to think about them. So we generally marginalize them. We push them gently to one side. And what we're trying to do as a charity, and other charities that do work similar to ourselves, is actually just get to people to think about them differently. Think about them as a potential employee. Think about them as having a major contribution to your business, but you have to recognize that you might have to do things slightly differently to accommodate their particular needs.
Yeah, totally. It's fascinating, and I think there's a lot of at the time as well that, and I've definitely look back on my own life and count some examples of when I can see a problem, but the problem, I don't really know where to get started with the problem, so
Yeah,
I leave it to somebody else to deal with the problem.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and and I'm assuming that happens quite a lot in this case as well. Is that actually, and this is what we were talking about all the way back at the beginning of this, I guess, is that stop looking at it as a problem and actually
yeah.
look at it
Don't
as
look
a
at it as
really
a problem.
wonderful opportunity. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And it's an opportunity for your business as well. And I mean, I've mentioned some of those benefits, but they tend to be loyalty, they tend to be longevity, they tend to be that they become extremely reliable and very competent. And
Mm.
often they're competent in a fairly narrow range of activities, but they can be extremely competent in that. Now, let me give you an example of that. We had one of our trainees, I think he left probably nearly 2 years ago now, and works as a kitchen porter in a pub. Now,
Yep.
he gets great delight and is absolutely fascinated with the flight dishwasher. He could
Right.
sit there all day. He would do 12 hours a day operating that flight dishwasher absolutely immaculately, and he would have no problem. He can refill it. It can do everything else that there is to do in terms of that flight dishwasher. The problem that the business has is telling him to stop sometimes and say, "Whoa, hang on a
Right.
minute! It's about time you took a break," because
Yeah.
he's autistic, and so they have a real incredible focus on things, and they can become immersed and fascinated by something that for the majority of us we say, oh, that's a real pain. I don't want to go and work on the dishwasher. Now, that again is one small example of how that business looked and saw what the potential was in that individual. He's a full member of the team. The team enjoy his company while he's actually working there, but he's doing a job that really most of the others would rather not do. But he's quite confident, quite capable, and quite happy in actually carrying out that task. And in a way, that's as a result of his disability. But he does, in doing that, he's getting great job satisfaction out of a job that the majority of us would get very little, if no satisfaction from at all. And I think that's about this thinking differently, recognizing the diversity, recognizing the disability, but also recognizing how it can work within the context of your business.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to talk about you. We've been
okay.
I could talk about this all day. I think it's a really wonderful thing that you're doing and kind of raising a profile of as well. So it's obviously one string to your bow. There's obviously one hell of a story behind that to get to this point in the first place. So take us all the way back to the beginning of your career. How did you set off on this trajectory?
I'll try and do it briefly, but I've been around several boys in several countries over quite a number of years. So I started off professionally. I started off training as a teacher. I trained as a teacher, and I taught for just on 2 years. And then one day I happened to be in a town and walked past an army recruiting office. At the time, I was getting a bit disillusioned with teaching in terms of the teaching profession. It wasn't being paid very well. And my wife was a teacher as well. To some extent, we were a little bit struggling. Anyway, so I went into an army recruiting office and I said, this is me. What can you offer me? And so I ended up as an officer, as you do,
Yep.
Well, I didn't want to go back to work, to be honest. I mean, I got the day off for doing a particular job and I didn't feel I needed to rush back to school. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just go and see what these guys have got to offer. Anyway, 6 months later, I found myself in the army. I went through all the necessary training. Ultimately, I went to Sandhurst. I did the whole 9 yards that one would do as an officer in the army. And I was in the Army Catering Corps. So I also did a long course. I learned to cook, if you like, in the army. I worked as a catering officer in a number of different countries. I then was able to do a long course, which the army sponsored for me, where I went to work for THF for a year on a sort of mutual exchange type program, where I worked in about 5 of the London THF hotels. The Hyde Park Hotel, as it was at the time, the Cavendish Hotel, where else? Grosvenor House Hotel. Sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes front of house, sometimes duty manager. I was a duty manager at the Cumberland Hotel for a while. That was an interesting experience in itself. Anyway, enough of those. Fascinating experience. And that gave me, if you like, a much broader set of insights into what the industry was about, as opposed to my little bit of it, which was really catering in the army. Anyway, in addition to spending that time, I was also able to spend time at the University of Surrey, where I did my undergraduate qualification, again as an army officer. Instead of taking 4 years, though, we only took 2 years to do it. So it was a bit. And then from there, when I left there, I went on and I did a research degree. So I became fascinated at the time in terms of, because computer systems were coming into play, we were beginning to use them much more in terms of, well, certainly in terms of the universities were becoming much more involved in the use of computing and what it could do. And one of my tutors was very involved in that. And I became fascinated with the idea of how could we apply, especially standalone microcomputing, to the army, and how could we use computers in the army to be more efficient and more effective in terms of what we were doing. So I designed a system for the army, which was,
of course you did.
Well, as you do. It was called CatPack, which stood for catering. I think it was a catering application. Catering. So it was basically a catering package for the army. And this was in the very early days that people were beginning to think about how could you use those systems. So some of it was stock control, some of it was recipe formulation, some of it was actually accounting and so on. So it was a sort of integrated package of how you would run a business through a standalone computer system. And that business was the army business, which was fine. So we had all the recipes, we had all the stock controls, all of those things. So I was able then to take that idea and make it work in reality, which again, the army supported me in doing that. So we ran some trials in units. I think we had 12 units where we of different sizes and types. We built the system ourselves largely, and we used some proprietary software, but largely built the system and managed it ourselves. And then we got the approval to actually put the system into 379 units across the world. So that's
Wow.
I didn't do that bit. I got to the point
Yeah,
of
right.
running the pilot, running the trial, and then I handed it over to a
On my
colleague
bit.
of
Thanks
mine.
very much.
I've done my bit, guys. It's up to you to install it. And if you want to go and spend time, literally in 379 units around the world. But it was a standalone computing system, and it was the first of its type standalone systems in the army at all. So
Wow. Right.
the army, yeah, the Army Catering Corps was at the forefront of thinking about how you could actually use microcomputer systems, basically, as opposed
Yeah,
to
yeah,
big
yeah.
mainframe systems in the army.
That's really cool.
And
Really
the,
cool.
the yeah the I mean, the system's not the same now, obviously, but there is
Of
still the
course, of course.
legacy of the idea is still actually being used even today. So, and then as a result of doing that additional work, I was able to write all that up for my research degree. So I was able to do that on a part-time basis by writing up the actual research that we were doing and then going through the protocols of actually conducting the research and then writing the reports. So I was able to use that on the basis of my research degree. So then I got to the point where I've been promoted. I was a lieutenant colonel by this time, and I was commanding part of the Army catering service in the British Army of the Rhine, as it was at the time. And I was there
Right.
in 1989, or was it 88? Anyway, I was there when the wall came down, when the Berlin Wall came down, which was quite a
Right, right.
significant moment, as you can well imagine. And that was
No doubt,
part of
yeah.
my responsibility as well. So the day after that they knocked the first hole in the wall, I was actually in Berlin watching the people coming through the hole in the wall. And fairly soon after that, I think we began to realize that the world, as far as we were concerned, had changed. The enemy was no longer behind the Berlin Wall. And so we had to completely change our thinking. And we knew at the time that there would, well, I think a lot of us did, that there would be a peace dividend as a result of that. And that's exactly what happened. So I took the opportunity when the opportunity presented itself to actually move on and leave the army, because I think I realized quite early on that my career opportunities within the service would be limited. I mean, I was a lieutenant colonel then. I could, with luck and a following wind, have reasonably expected to become a brigadier. By the time when I left the service, we still had, I think, a brigadier left. But within a few years, my contemporaries that stayed in either stayed at the same rank, or the highest rank they could achieve would be a colonel. So I thought, well, you're into a shrinking organization that's fundamentally going to change. I couldn't quite see the same future opportunities within it. So I then, again, this was sort of serendipitous. It wasn't quite like walking past a army recruiting office, but close to, that somebody suggested to me that, well, why don't you think about, becoming an academic? Or, you've got the qualifications, you've got a teaching qualification, you could do that. So I applied for a job at what was then Dorset Institute of Higher Education, thinking there's no chance I'll do this, but it will be good experience, to do this. And I was going to become the head of the academic department of food and catering, or at least that was the role that was on offer. I came over from Germany, because that's where I was stationed at the time, went to the interview, and lo and behold, they offered me the job. So you're then thinking to yourself, okay, now what do
Oh
I
God,
do?
what now? Yeah.
Yeah, what now? I was only coming over just to see what the whole experience might be, bearing in mind the last time I'd applied for a job was when I went into the army recruiting office. So
Right.
anyway, and the rest,
Stuff got real.
yeah, it got real. So I then resigned, and then 6 months later they had to wait 6 months for me because that's the way the army works. And then I resigned and then took up the role at what was then Dorset Institute of Higher Education. I stayed for 10 years, by which time I'd become the head of the School of Service Industries, which was one of the largest schools in the university at the time, covering off everything from retail management, leisure management, hospitality management, food and catering, food science, food quality, land-based enterprise, all sorts of stuff. And then I was headhunted to go and run the Blue Mountains Hotel Schools in Australia, which took me
Oh,
out of the
wow.
country for 4 years.
Yeah.
So I became the chief
Not
executive
a
and
bad part of the
principal.
world either.
No, very nice part of the world, actually. We had two hotel schools in Australia. We had a 50% share of a hotel school in New Zealand, and we had two partner institutions, 50% ownership type things in China. So I stayed there for just something nearly 5 years, where I was the principal there, and then came back to the UK. When I came back to the UK, I took an interim management job as the head of the London School of Hospitality and Tourism, as it was called at the time, which was then which is now part of the University of West London. That was originally going to be a sort of 6-month job, turned out to be 2.5 years. And then from
How
there,
often does that happen?
yeah, a lot, I think, a lot,
Yeah.
interim. Yeah, of
Yeah.
course it is. Yeah, yeah, fine. Yeah. Yeah, we'll find somebody.
Yeah.
Don't worry. It'll be okay. 2.5 years later. And then I was invited, really, I suppose, to work for the Edge Foundation because Gary Hawkes was the chair of the Edge Foundation, previous, Gardner Merchant fame and so on. And the Edge Foundation was an educational charity that had quite a lot of money. And he'd always had this dream of having a hotel school, a UK based hotel school. I knew Gary from way back from my time at Bournemouth, and we kept in touch, funnily enough, while I was still in Australia, because he had some interest in Australia at the time. When I came back, I made contact with him again. He came and we had lunch together when I was still at the University of West London. And he said, I want a hotel school in the UK. Can you get me one? And I said,
Yeah.
well, how much money have you got? So he said, well, probably about 10 million. I said, well, okay, we'll give it a shot. That's not quite exactly how the conversation went, but I then went
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
work.
That's just as easy as that. Yeah.
I then went to work for the Edge Foundation, and I became the project director for what then turned out to be the Edge Hotel School, which is based at Wivenhoe House and is now part of the University of Essex. But that I think that took me from about 2007 to 2012. Yeah. So we came up with the idea in 2007. We knew what we wanted, but finding the right location and the right partners was really, really hard. And that took quite a long time. But then we eventually opened the Edge Hotel School at Wivenhoe House in 2012. And it's been going strong ever since.
Yeah. No doubt. No doubt. And we've had Adrian Martin on the
Adrian
show.
Martin.
He's
Yeah.
one of the
Yeah.
lecturers there. I think deputy head now.
Yeah.
And comedy genius, as I've alluded to. He's a very funny guy. But
Yeah.
I'm quite interested. Well, actually, I'm not quite interested. I'm very, very interested because to me that's coming back to what we were talking about earlier on. When you see a problem in front of you, and sometimes the problem looks too difficult to deal with, so you go, well, we'll just
Yeah.
this wasn't really a choice with this project. This is a kind of let's find a way to make this happen. And
Yeah.
I'm kind of really intrigued around how do you take the first steps in that when I suppose in principle have not got experience of doing something similar. Is it a case of you just kind of have to roll your sleeves up and start researching, start looking at what is possible?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, there are models around. So, bearing in mind, I was running hotel schools in Australia and I became very familiar with hotel school models because there are a vast variety of different ways of running hotel schools. But as a
Yeah.
result of my experiences, not just in Australia, but traveling quite widely, especially with links that we were having with Switzerland, with China, with India, and so on, to be able to look and say, well, as a result of this, what seems to work, what works best, what would be the best model that we could think about. So we then, the first thing to do was to really come up with a conceptual model in your head, which says, my ideal hotel school would look like this. So once we got to that point, we were then saying, well, okay, if that's what it's going to look like, how do we operationalize that? What do we need to put in place to make that a reality? Well, for us, in the first instance, it was location, it was premises. You can't set a hotel school up in an office block. You know, the idea always in my head and in Gary's head as well was that it should be based on a functional hotel. It needs to be real. It needed to be that sense of realism where you've got something where the students are actually fully engaged in making something work. And it had got to be of the right standard, because otherwise you can go to some hotel schools where all they're doing is running their own accommodation for their own students. Well, that's fine, but how do you establish what you really want as the pinnacle of your education and training, which is that students understand what the real top quality looks like? So the only way that you're going to get them to understand what the real top quality looks like is giving them some experience of actually how to get there. Because it doesn't matter thereafter what level they work at, they always understand things like attention to detail, detailed customer service, the right approach, the right mindset, and so on. So we'd always got in our mind that it needed to be a properly operational, functional hotel as the basis of it, on a commercial basis or semi-commercial basis. So we then looked around, and we had a couple of abortive attempts at finding places. We made bids for places. We were shown sites that would have cost far more money than we possibly got to be able to convert or put back into fully operational functioning again. We got outbid by a property developer at a place up in Yorkshire, in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. That was annoying because the property developer, as far as I'm aware, has only just, and we're talking about 15, 20 years later, has only just done the conversion to turn it into a proper hotel. Anyway, so that's another story. So we then found through mutual contacts, we were then put in touch with the University of Essex, who had a building that was originally a Georgian building, which was now being run as a sort of small conference centre type thing. So it had got some accommodation already in place and so on. But the university was unsure in the longer term what to do with this building. And we went to them essentially with the idea and said, hey, look, bearing in mind we got some money. And so we could say to them, look, would you be interested in working with us on refurbishing, basically completely renovating that into a hotel from a conference center? So in part, it was already being used for what you could call a hotel type accommodation. And they were very interested in the idea, and we agreed on how we were going to take it forward, and that was it. And I then became the project director on behalf of the university and the Edge Foundation to turn this building into both a hotel and a hotel school. And that's exactly what we did. But it took us longer than we anticipated, as you can well imagine, as these things do. So we did a complete renovation on the building, stripped it back to the originals, and tried to reconstruct it as far as possible. And it is a 4-star country house hotel.
5-star hospitality means having the right people in the right place at the right time, and that's exactly where RotaCloud can help. RotaCloud is the online platform that makes planning rotas, recording attendance, and managing annual leave easy. Its simple, drag-and-drop interface lets you create and share rotas with your team in minutes, while our built-in budgeting tools mean you'll know exactly how much you're spending on staffing before sending the rota out. RotaCloud also makes life easier for your staff, allowing them to check their rotas, request time off, and pick up extra shifts, all through the RotaCloud mobile app. Start your 30-day free trial today by visiting rotacloud.com/Phil and find out how much easier managing your team can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I would imagine that half of the battle here is finding an educational partner who sees the vision and sees the value in the vision, and also sees the value that it then brings to the educational organisation as well, because then that's, I suppose that's half the battle of taking any project forward is getting everybody at the table.
Yeah. And it was finding that right partner, and I think we were lucky there. We were. I think it was a question of, it wasn't quite serendipitous again, but that seems to be the story of my life, really, that, sooner or later, there might be something that seems to be the right opportunity. And I always say to people, if it is an opportunity, it looks right, feels right, and smells right, do it. Otherwise, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. So, and we got to that stage with the university, and we were lucky. The vice chancellor at the time was very supportive. He saw the opportunity that we could create, and they, of course, invested the same amount of money in the project as we did. They were quite happy to let us get on with it and run it, but they invested quite a lot of money in the building, obviously, because the building needed an awful lot of work doing to it. But then what they then did, we as all these projects, you go through all sorts of organizational change, largely because circumstances change, mood swings change, and so on. So our original intention was to run it ourselves as the Edge Foundation, with an operating partner, an educational partner, which was also a partner of the university. That worked fine for a while, but unfortunately then that organisation withdrew, not just from us, but from the whole of the UK. It was an American-based organisation. So you think, where do we go now? So we took it back in-house again to run it again, separate from the university, but as a partner of the university, as the Edge Hotel School Limited, and actually as a private setup. And then I think we got to the stage where, it was like that classic advert, I like the product so much that I decided to buy it, that the university then came along and said, well, look, this is a bit silly. Why don't we just take it over and then run it effectively as a school, as a department of the university? And that's where we got to. So, and that was good for the school, it was good for the university, and it came again at just the right sort of time, because at that point the Edge Hotel School Limited owed the university quite a lot of money, which was their contribution to the refurbishment and the initial operational startup costs. So, and that was being paid back as a debenture over time. And then, but basically the university said, well, okay, we'll just forget that. Effectively, they bought our share of the institution for what we owed them. Hey, presto, that's where we are today.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And how was that then for you? Because I would imagine that, you poured your heart and soul into making this happen. And so when it finally did, there must have been this wonderful, we're doing this. This is, we're actually going to be doing something that's making a really great difference in the way that people get educated about hospitality, and specifically hotels.
Yeah.
And they can take that into a lot of different types of hospitality. It doesn't have to just be a hotel.
Absolutely.
Afterwards.
Yeah.
But how did that feel then for you when you've done this, and then you you come to a natural end with it, and you've got to then, I suppose, look to something else? Because you said that took you up to 2012, which was more or less around about the time that it opened.
That's correct.
How did that feel in that moment?
That was okay, actually, because bearing in mind, as you said, that you poured your heart and soul into something over an extended period, at least 5 years, probably longer, if I go back even further to when we were thinking about the idea. So you put your heart and soul into it, you open the doors. I was still involved, so I was still a member of the board, and so I still had an input into it. But the thing I didn't want, and I was quite clear about that when I got to that point, I didn't want to be involved on an operational day-to-day basis. And so, I felt I'd done all those things. I'd been an operator, I'd run businesses, I'd run hotel schools, I'd done all that stuff on a day-to-day basis, but I didn't really want to go back to that, because I saw that to some extent, not as going backwards, but I saw that I understood what the ongoing commitment would be in terms of doing it. I was still living in Bournemouth. The operation was in Colchester. So, I was spending my weeks
exactly a daily commute.
No, not exactly. So I was spending my weeks in Colchester and coming home at the weekends and all that good stuff that you do in those circumstances. So yeah, I did go back and run it for a little while when we had to go through the different transitions to until we could find the right people. I mean, at one stage I was both the hotel manager and the principal of the hotel school.
Right.
But not for very long, and we had plenty of support and things as well. But so that wasn't my long-term objective. That's not what I wanted to do. So then when that came, I'd been planning for it. So it wasn't as though there was something in my head that went, oh my God, what am I going to do now? Oh, it was more about there is a natural transition here from what that was to what I then wanted to be more engaged with, which was this perhaps bigger portfolio. Because as you can imagine, if you're running something like a project and you're the project director for it, that is a pretty full-on full-time job. You're getting phone calls at
Yeah.
all times of the day or night for different things. And so I was able then to fairly transition, if you like, into much more of wanting to do the things that I wanted to do, as opposed to things which I was being required to do as part of a role. And I certainly didn't want any full-time role of any kind again. So that's enabled me then to move on to this much more sort of portfolio approach of doing the things that I interest me, stimulate me, and I want to get involved with. And there
Well,
was
that's the dream, isn't it?
well, yeah, I guess so for a lot of people.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you think the way that the world is now, just in terms of the price of everything, cost of everything, that doing a project like the Edge Hotel School is still possible? It's still feasible in today's climate?
I think it's possible and is feasible, but again, it's almost like you've got to get the conjunction and confluence of all the different sets of influences and interests all coming together in the same place at the same time. And that's the problem, really. And it's how do you do that? And there's no simple solution in terms of how that can achieve. I think it's harder at the moment because people would be much more concerned about, as you say, the cost of everything. But also, I'm not sure that I was going to be a bit presumptuous there and say the intellectual climate is right, in the sense that I think, and a lot of it is still the sort of the influence of the post-pandemic, is that people are much more reluctant to take on things. They're still trying to re-establish, if you like, what is the norms? What are the norms? And we've gone through quite a few fairly violent sets of changes, and I think it's going to take a while before that sort of settles itself down, and we become a little bit more confident in our own ability to do things. And if I give you an example from an industry point of view, I've worked with a number of different restaurants, hotel groups, and that sort of thing. You think about the way that some of the restaurants now are operating, where they now close on a Monday and a Tuesday, open at Wednesday lunchtime, close again on Sunday lunchtime. Why are they doing that? Well, costs. You haven't got the same footfall and customer base on a Monday and a Tuesday that you will have for the rest of the week. It means that you can have a different staffing complement, so that you've got staff that you're not necessarily expecting them to have the same sort of work shift patterns that they've had in the past. So it's coming up with different operational models that suit the business, but also suit the staff and also suit the client base. And those things are still taking time to work through. And I don't know, there is still that hankering in a way, I think, in certain areas, which says, I want to go back. Well, you can never go back. You can only ever go forward.
Yeah.
So instead of thinking, well, that's what we used to do, let's go back to doing what we used to do, you've got to think about, well, what's changed in the world? What do I need to change in order to have a better position and place in the world? And that part of that thinking process is one that I think businesses in particular find a struggle with, because they know what was happening before. They were confident in the nature of that operational model. They could predict it. They could budget for it, if you like. They could give a reasonable idea of what what their rate of return might be. But as soon as you start to change these things, it's not just changing your mindset, it's changing all those operational processes and practices as well. And that's part of the issue. I don't think we've got to the stage where people have changed sufficiently or are thinking to the future sufficiently to feel confident of knowing that they've got things reasonably right, that they would then be prepared to say, okay, well, let's do this then.
Yeah, no. I suppose that's because I guess in real terms we're living this now. In the sense that a lot of these pressures that are coming into the marketplace are still quite new, really.
Yes, they are.
And in the grand scheme of things. And of course, then we had the budget last week, which brings in some more pressures scheduled for next year.
Sure.
And so there's always this changing landscape, I guess, around the pressures that will come in.
Yeah.
The thing that I had in my head was when I met with Adrian and we were talking about the Edge Hotel School in its current form and how well it was doing. And it was thriving on the back of regrettably other people's closures, really. And really, you're kind of one of you're not there anymore, of course. But the Edge Hotel School is kind of one of the last remaining practically focused educational places as well, where you can take what you've learned in a classroom and then go and apply that in a live environment, which is exactly unbelievably valuable. Unbelievably valuable.
And that was the whole philosophy that we had right from the very first. Thinking about what this was going to look like. So it was very much about learning through doing. It was very much about imbuing the students with a professional culture right from day one, where and if they go to a university, any university pretty much these days, they don't get any of that professional culture. It doesn't come into the way that they are encouraged to think about themselves, the industry, and the study that they're doing as well. Because I used to liken it to, okay, we're dealing with potential hospitality managers here. They're not doctors, they're not nurses, but let's look at the way that doctors and nurses and engineers and those types of professions where you have to learn how to use your hands at the same time as you have to learn how to use your brain. And when you think about that, there's quite a lot of potential crossover. And so that was part of our overall philosophy, in that how do you get the students to really understand what it means to work in that type of professional environment? It's not the sort of thing that you can do by having a module in a course which says, professional culture and practice or something, and where somebody lectures them for 30 hours about what it means. It can only come actually from experiencing it and actually doing it yourself. And so when the students are working in the Edge Hotel School, they're wearing the uniform. We used to, in my Australian experience, the Blue Mountains Hotel Schools, what we did, they wore uniform all the time, whether they're in the classroom or whether they were actually in the practical operations. They were wearing a uniform. It was the most awful colour blue, and I kept trying to change it, but they wouldn't have it. The students kept saying to me, no, we love it. We're known as blueies. It was an awful colour. But anyway, that's beside the point. But it also goes back to my army experiences and practice. If you put somebody in not just a uniform, but you put them in the culture of the organization, what happens to them? Well, if you put them in a uniform, the first thing happens is they tend to stand up straighter. All right. So, it gives them, there is a sense of purpose. There's a sense of pride that, I'm wearing the uniform for a reason. And this is the reason I'm wearing that uniform. So, it does have that tendency to make them stand up slightly straighter, if you like, and to look outwards as opposed to be introspective and looking inwards all the time. So that's the first thing. And then if you move on from there, what is it giving them? It's giving them those professional boundaries and that professional culture. It shows them how there is the expectation about how to behave in those circumstances. How do you greet a guest? How do you deal with your fellows, especially when you're in a public setting? It's putting them on the stage, if you like. And again, we used to do a lot of that work actually in Australia as well, where the idea was that they are part of the theatre of hospitality. They're on the stage, they are performing. And they have to know and feel confident. And the key for me was giving them the confidence to do it. And the only way you could give them the confidence to do it was by putting them in those circumstances in a controlled environment, well supported, to build their confidence. So I knew that every single student that was leaving us would have the confidence to go and face that workplace. And of course, that confidence comes through when they're being interviewed, because again, they sit up straight, they look at you, they're engaged with their eyes with you as well. So, but how do you get to that particular stage? I mean, something I used to feel very proud of. So when I was running the hotel schools, we were based up in Lura in the Blue Mountains. It was a series of old buildings, and we had about 6 entrances. You could get into the place from all over the place. There were there were doors, obviously, but no real security barriers. We had a reception, but I knew that if somebody came in to the school for using any of the doors, the first student that they would come into contact with would say to them, good morning or good afternoon. Can I help you? Where do you need to be taken to? If you'd like to come with me, I would take you to reception. And why? Because they had the confidence in themselves. They knew what was expected of them, and they knew how to greet guests and actually bring them into that environment. So it was that sort of thing that I think is the huge difference between a student coming out of a hotel school, especially somewhere like the Edge Hotel School, and a student that even now will probably have very, very limited professional exposure, because very few university courses these days have placements. Some still do, some are optional, but they do not have that professional exposure in the workplace that we always used to have. And it is that professional exposure. And I don't mean just you go and do 3 field visits and you go and visit this hotel and you go and visit that hotel. That's not what I mean. It's the professional exposure actually of working in that environment, working as a member of a team and interacting over a reasonable period with guests, because it's only by doing that you get that professional culture and you get the professional confidence to be able to handle it.
Yeah, turning up on time, smartly dressed, taking pride. The stuff you kind of take for granted, really. But yeah, indeed. But they all play the part.
Yeah. But if you've got students that have not experienced that in their own environment, haven't experienced it they may have experienced it as guests, but not necessarily as part of that workforce. So how do you create that in their own minds? And how do you give them that opportunity, really, unless you can do it in a professional environment? And that's what the hotel school was all about, is creating that sort of professional environment for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one thing that I absolutely remembered from my time. I spent half a day with Adrian. He very kindly gave me a slot to kind of give the students a chat about life after uni and all of that kind of stuff, and it was really interesting. But the thing that I remember was the confidence that was in the students. It was plain to see, their ability to interact. They didn't get, there was none of this wide-eyedness of a guest speaker coming in, and it was like they wanted to interact, they wanted to ask questions. And I absolutely loved that. I thought that, this is, as I think as Adrian puts it, I think it's Michael Voigt that says it at the Goring, that the students come into the workforce oven ready. That was the phrase.
And that's what we were aiming for. It was giving them that confidence to be able to go into work on their very first day in their very first full-time job, to be able to stand up straight and say, right, I'm here, what do you want me to do? And whatever it is, I know I will do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously you've now got a portfolio of stuff that you get your head into. Give us a kind of snapshot overview of the things that you have been involved in since then.
Well, I've done all sorts of stuff. Interestingly, I was doing some work as an academic reviewer and quality assurance, I guess, in Lithuania. That was an extremely interesting experience, going round and looking at what was going on in those sort of Baltic countries, and where I was chairing university review panels, and we went round to visit overall, I think I must have probably done about between 8 and 10 different universities in Lithuania. And you begin to look and you think to yourself, well, that's fascinating, because they're doing things that we're not doing, and yet we think of ourselves as being, we're at the forefront of education and so on. And they have a mixed system. They have more private institutions than we do. So there's a mix between private and public institutions. And they are often much fleeter of foot. They're much more innovative. They can actually change. And of course, they're in an economy that, as they see, would have been what they refer to as the Soviet era. So they're still emerging in some senses from quite a long legacy of doing things in a particular didactic and very bureaucratic way. But they've moved away from that, and they realize now that they have to change and they have to innovate, and they have to recognize what the world needs from their students. Not, I know what's best for you, because I'm an academic, I'll tell you what the world needs. They go out and they find out what the world needs, whether it's in philosophy, whether it's in arts, whether it's in architecture, whether it's in business, whether it's in tourism, whatever. And so they tend to be much more outward facing, I would suggest, than many. Certainly UK tends to be much more introspective and looking at itself and saying, we always come within the rankings as being very good for education, but in my humble opinion, I think they're far too introspective. They need to get out more than they do at the moment and understand what's going on in the world around them. You can look at places like India, the Middle East, Australia, obviously, where you've got a different sort of culture of higher education, then things are changing much more rapidly there. They're much more innovative. They're much more prepared to move and do things differently, whereas we seem to be a bit structured and strictured in terms of the way that we make things work. So that's been interesting exercises. I've done that. As I said, I'm very involved with YAHOFA, which is the International Association of Hotel Schools, where I'm an advisor to the board. I was on the board, but now I'm a special advisor to the board. I chair a academic council in a college in Nepal, which is, again, a very interesting experience when you look at what's going on in that particular part of the world. I chair the professional review panel for the Institute of Hospitality, where we look at accreditation, and this is from academic institutions from across the world that want the Institute's accreditation. And we do the same thing for businesses who want their training programs endorsed. So that gives me a very interesting oversight of what's happening across the world in terms of hospitality education. So, for example, we've done some recently in Holland, France, obviously the UK, Australia, India. So we get quite a mixed bag in terms of where we get those applications from. So that gives me an oversight that otherwise I wouldn't necessarily have. And that's through reading the documents of what they're doing, how they're doing it, the way that they look at it, and the philosophy behind it. And you can tend to see, and that's where you get the differences really emerging between what's going on in one country compared to the others. And then you can make judgments to some extent about, well, hang on, they've got some really good ideas there. There's really good thinking going on there. Why aren't we doing that in this country? So anyway, that's part and parcel of my portfolio.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, God, what a journey so far, and some of the stuff that you're getting into, I think, is really great as well, because the point you make as well about us looking outwards as opposed to inwards. I think you've probably got to do a little bit of both to get the best of everything, right? It's always healthy to look introspectively and understand, who you are and what you stand for and all of that kind of stuff. But and that evolves through time, probably. But yeah, I mean, we're innovation doesn't always have to come from within, and rarely does, right? I mean, it comes from places that you least expect it sometime, in the moments that you least expect.
Yeah, and they are often innovating as the result of some sets of external pressures, but also that sort of thought process of thinking to themselves, of understanding. Yeah, I take your point about introspection. They understand where they are. They understand how they got to where they are. They understand what their strengths are. They understand what their weaknesses are. And as a result of that, they know where their place is in the world, but they also have a vision for where they want it to be. And I think where we get a bit stuck is that we get stuck sometimes on the processes of understanding where we are, and we allow, if you like, the systems, the bureaucracy of some of the systems, to impose strictures on us, which prevents us from doing things. Now, I can give you some educational examples that might not mean much to the listeners, but nevertheless. So if you take, for example, something like creative arts, then there will be, we chunk up education into predetermined blocks of study. We call them either units or module or courses or whatever, and we give them a certain number of credits. So if you think about that in higher education, generally speaking, there will be in 10 or 20 credit units, and they will be added together, which then makes up a course. Now, if you think about the way the world works, the world doesn't work by chunking all these bits up and then allocating time and learning hours and credits to those things. The world works differently. So if you look at the way creative arts do things, they do chunk things up, but they're much, much bigger chunks than we do. So instead, they will have a whole 60 credits, if you like, half a year's worth of credit that will be based around perhaps a creative project, because they know that in students going to have to bring in so many different skill sets, so many different levels of understanding and knowledge in order to make that project work. It could be a design project, it could be a graphic design project, it could be a video project, it could be all sorts of things. But you're applying a whole range of different skill sets in order to make something work. What we tend to do is to say, learn that, tell us all about it, and then you can move on to the next bit. And I always used to make the point, especially when we're talking about the hotel schools, was that we tend to do things like business, business, if you like. So you've got accounting, you will have a management program of some kind, you'll have a marketing program of some kind, you'll have an HR program, and so on. But then I said to myself, well, okay, I'm currently running a business, the Blue Mountains Hotel Schools. Do I go in the morning and lay out my diary and go, okay, from 9 till 10 this morning, I'm going to do HR. From 10 till 11, I'm going to do accounting. No. I go in and I say, how am I going to make this business run a bit better today than it was yesterday? And I do that by walking around, finding out what's going on, trying to identify where there might be areas where I need to intervene, and when I don't need to intervene, let them get on with it. So how do I run that business? I don't run that business by chunking it up and pretending that I'm going to do certain things. I do those things and I apply the knowledge and skills and understanding at the time I need it. Where we miss out, I think, and where the hotel schools can benefit is that you try and encourage that degree of integration, so you understand that you're dealing with the whole, not the sum of the parts. And that's where I think innovation, especially in some of these other countries, works much better. They're much more perhaps project orientated, they're much more integrated in their approach. They try and make sure everything hangs together and they can see the relationship. So if you've got a student who might be working on food service, for example, but how are they actually managing what the profitability is in that food service operation? So they should be getting the data to see what the degree of the profitability of that business might be. Can they get it down to the service that they were responsible for? Whatever. But at the moment it be right, this is the service, this is accounting, those two things never come together. But actually in the real world, they're together all the time. You can't take them apart.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, look, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story. What a journey you've had so far. Still got your head in some really amazing stuff, which is great. One question I am going to ask you before I let you get on your merry way is stories, little anecdotes. Have you got any funny stories from your career at any stage?
Yeah, some of them probably are not repeatable.
Yes, not for public consumption. Yes.
Not necessarily for public consumption. I guess you've got all sorts of stories over time. And of course, most of them, to me, the story is more about relaying the nature of the experience and understanding what you got from that particular experience. So I'll give you just one, I think, which is probably the largest catering job I've ever been involved with. So in the Queen's Silver Jubilee, I was working in Germany, obviously as a soldier, and I was given the job of being the catering officer for the Queen's Jubilee Review, which took place a long way away from where I was stationed at the time. But then building or I wasn't building, but that there was being built at the time. There was being the parade ground, if you want to call it that, which was on a training area. And bearing in mind that the Jubilee Review the Army Jubilee Review just had huge parades of tanks, guns, soldiers, whatever, an enormous, great big affair. And I was part of the team. There was my boss, and I was there full time. He was there part time, and we were running this operation. So we were feeding at the time in the support run up. We were probably feeding about 2,000 people a day in about 5 different locations around this very big training area. We were preparing to feed the Queen, which was always, I've done it before, but is always a much smaller event. I think we had 30 to 40 covers, no more. And the menu for any of those royal events was always very straightforward. It was not a lot of messing about. So it was generally smoked salmon, followed by a lamb, followed by raspberries and cream. End of story.
Yeah.
Dead easy.
Yeah.
You submit different menus to the palace, and then you get a menu back with a tick on it, and you always knew what the preferences were before you started. So it was pretty sure you were going to have some sort of variation on that theme. That wasn't the difficulty. Anyway, so there we are feeding all these thousands of soldiers all over the place at all times of the day or night. They're doing all the preparation. As we got nearer to the event, obviously we were feeding more and more. I think towards the end, on the last few days, we probably were feeding around about 10,000 people a day for 3 meals and plus supper. So it's quite a big logistics operation. Anyway, there were the one story I've got out of that is one of our bosses, not my direct boss, but his direct boss. And of course, we knew what the menu was for the Queen. It wasn't going to be overly complicated, and it was going to be raspberries. But these had to be Scottish raspberries, okay? So we go through our normal... go through our normal supply procurement. This is in July. So we go through the normal supply procurement things, and we order probably, I don't know, 3 times as many raspberries as we're ever going to likely to need for the day on the event. Right. And of course, what we didn't know was that our boss's boss was panicking about these bloody raspberries, whether we were going to get the right raspberries in the right quality or the right quantity. So he took it upon himself, unbeknownst to us entirely, to order virtually the same amount of raspberries as we'd already ordered completely separately and have them shipped over and then delivered to us. So on the day itself, or the day before the day itself, we ended up with raspberries coming out of absolutely bloody everywhere. And we had in the end, after having fed the Queen and the 30 odd covers that were with her, with these raspberries, we had enough raspberries left over to feed at least another 5,000 soldiers with raspberry flan or raspberry fool or raspberry whatever for the next 3 days. Yes, we had far too many raspberries, but that's a classic. Absolutely, especially under those circumstances. Have we got enough? Will we get enough? Anyway.
Yes, you
will.
We
had more than
you'll
enough.
Have enough
we had more than enough.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much for your time and chatting to us about your journey today, Peter. I wish you well with whatever it is that's next. I mean, it sounds like Crumbs will keep you occupied and busy in the right way.
It does, yeah. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and very much look forward to hearing what happens next, and wish you all the very best with that.
Well, thanks for that very much. Man. Thanks for the time.
My absolute pleasure. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
And there we have it. What a wonderful journey from Peter, and fascinating to hear how everything came together around the Edge Hotel School. He also raises some fantastic points around his work at the Crumbs project. We will of course be back at 8 PM next Wednesday with another cracking story from hospitality, so until then, have a great week and we'll see you then.